You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. My guest today is Professor Michael Sachs. He's in the Biomedical Engineering Department. He's also the chair in computational cardiology at the Odin Institute. It's all part of the James Willerson Center for Cardiovascular Modeling and Simulation. And again, Michael's a professor of both biomedical and mechanical engineering. So welcome, Mike. Thanks for coming.
You bet.
Yeah, tell me about your research. What got you interested in our cardiovascular system and our heart in the first place? And then we'll go into your current research.
Oh, well, yeah, I've been interested in cardiovascular function for many years, really since I was a grad student, where I did my PhD at UT Southwestern up in Dallas. And I was actually in a cardiopulmonary laboratory where we learned not just about the heart, but also the lung and the and how they interacted. And I found the whole thing was just such a fascinating system. My academic research really started my academic career looking at the function of heart valves. And although I consider myself primarily a heart modeler, the valves sort of kind of caught my interest at the time. I thought they were easier than modeling the heart, and it turned out it's not the case at all. And then through that, I got involved with replacement heart valves, and in particular, the materials and tissues that make up those valve leaflets and all the parts and how they work in an amazingly complicated system, and probably the most mechanically demanding part of the cardiovascular system.
Yeah, a friend of mine's daughter had a heart valve replaced, and I guess somehow various kind of bacteria got into it, so it has to be like replaced again or cleaned out, or I'm not sure of the circumstance, but is that a common thing that happens once a valve is replaced, let's say?
Yeah, so one of the major, there are kind of two major problems with valve therapy. First of all, this is all part of the family of what's called heart valve disease. It affects hundreds of thousands of Americans and many hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. And it comes in many forms, and there's many types of therapy. But very often, a common treatment, particularly for the aortic valve in adults, is to replace the valve and with a synthetic device. And that can work quite well in the short term, but in the long run, they they suffer from continued durability problems, so they wear out. And there's many designs and types. The fundamental problem is with the leaflets, that is the flaps, if you will, that make up the valve, and the materials that they're composed of.
So when a heart valve is replaced, I mean, are bacteria just going to attack it no matter what? Like, how long does it take? What's the typical wear or infection pattern for replacements?
Yeah, all the above. I mean, so if it's a replacement, say in an adult, say someone in their 50s or 60s or older, then generally what happens is the valve will fail due to degeneration of the materials that make up the leaflets. And these leaflets are made from, they're generally not synthetic. They're made actually from a soft tissue that surrounds the heart. It's called the pericardium, from the Greek peri, meaning around, the cardium, the heart. And it is a dense connective tissue, kind of like skin. And it's a animal byproduct, from the beef industry. And it's usually made from cow pericardium, sometimes pig or other animals. And then it will be processed, cleaned, and chemically treated and formed into a leaflet. And it's an amazingly durable material, but it's not living, and it eventually degenerates just through wear and tear. And that'll often happen in about 8 to 12 years, give and take. Exactly depends depends on, and every person's different, every application is different, so it's not a hard timeline. The other major mechanism is what's called calcification, and this usually happens when it's implanted a little younger, maybe people in their 40s or 50s, certainly in juvenile cases where the blood and other aspects of the implant mechanisms will cause the valve to actually calcify. It actually forms mineral deposits, and it stiffens and eventually degenerates and fails. And then you have to go in there and replace it, which could be.
What about in women versus men? Like, being a man myself, my doctor said, they go, your iron is building up. You should do a bunch of, you should donate blood a bunch to get the iron down. So what happens differently in a woman versus a man as they get older? If the valve in a man, for instance, is exposed to like much higher levels of circulating iron, does that cause different bacteria to attack it, or does it degrade it differently versus a woman?
Yeah, well, it's actually calcium. And what it is, it's actually, there is a tendency for the human body to react to synthetic implants. And for reasons that are not completely well understood, that's when it actually combines with the phosphorus in the blood, form calcium phosphate bone, effectively, and those form as little nodules and eventually expand and require the valve, will cause the valve to fail. It will sometimes happen differently because of the difference between men and women because of their calcium metabolism, and a big factor is patient age. So the younger you are, the more aggressively these valves will calcify, and that's why one of the biggest problems is doing this in juveniles or people with, particularly with patients with congenital defects. That's one issue. But the calcification and structural degeneration can go hand in hand, and depending on the age and the sex and other factors, the valve will fail.
Why is the calcium chemistry and circulating calcium level different in younger people, and why women versus men?
It's an age effect. I mean, we generally, our metabolisms and our ability to grow and repair tissues become more compromised as you get older. And there's the whole calcium metabolism, which is used to grow and maintain bony tissues, begins to slow down. Obviously, also in postmenopausal women as well, and that effect greatly affects how the body reacts to the implanted valve.
Okay. That makes sense. And you mentioned a leaflet. What is the morphology or shape of the valve, and what makes it complicated to model?
Yeah, the valve is generally most valves are tri-leaflet. They have 3 leaflets, and they form kind of a cuspal shape, and they all come together in the center, and they form a seal, and they sort of imitate the anatomy of the native aortic heart valve. It's a very stable design and works quite well. And in nature, the major difference with a human valve, a living valve, is that all the parts of the valve and all the fibers and other elements of the valve are constantly maintained by the cells that live inside the valve leaflet. So it's actually a living structure, and they are very important for maintaining that dense connective tissue the native valve leaflets are made out of. And that's part of the reason why most people will go through an entire life with their valve with no problems, and the valve will function anywhere between 3 and 5 billion times, with no problem. So it's an amazing level of durability. Obviously in human-made synthetic replacement valves, you can't match it because it's not living.
With an expected replacement time, let's say of 8 years or 10 years, how much does it have to withstand, and how much of a factor of safety do you need? Like, if the average time is 8 years, do you need it to go for 12? And how many beats is that? 1 billion, let's say, or 500 million?
If you're talking about what it takes for a manufacturer to design, test, and evaluate, it could be anywhere from 5 to, it's a long time. It's at least 5 years, sometimes longer, and they have to go through clinical trials. It's a very elaborate process that is regulated by the FDA.
No, but I mean, do they make them designed to last for, a couple of years longer than the typical replacement window, or do they have to design it to last like 30 years?
Well, most of the effort efforts have been in recent years have been dedicated not to improving the material. There's been a little bit of work on that in industry, but it's more about how the valve is delivered. And so a very revolutionary change that happened about, maybe 15 years ago, was the invention of the transcutaneous valve, what's called TAVR, which is transcutaneous aortic valve replacement. And in this case, instead of being the old way to do it would be what's called a surgical valve, and these are still used. They are on a rigid or semi-rigid frame. You have to go through heart-lung bypass. You open up the chest. The valves, the existing disease valve is removed. The new valve is sutured into place. It's closed up and tested, and then they take the patient off bypass and then close the chest up. And it's a fairly elaborate procedure with takes weeks to recover. Transcutaneous valves kind of get around this problem in part because while the leaflets are made of the same materials, it's actually mounted into the valve is mounted onto a frame that can be collapsed down. That can be inserted in a catheter, usually from a leg artery up into the heart, and then allowed to expand and held in place. And then the catheter is removed. And these have been really quite successful. The recovery times are generally relatively short. Complications are relatively minor on average, although there are, particularly in the early days, there were more issues. The challenge with them is durability, which is that since they're made out of the same materials, their durability problems have remained. The major advantage here is that the delivery of the valve is much more tractable, and the patients can go home usually within a couple days.
You don't have to open up their chest to do it. You can do it through like the femoral artery. Possibly,
that's right. Yeah, there's a number of different access routes and techniques depending on which valve and which method. And this has been relatively successful in the aortic valve. That's the valve between the left heart and the ascent in the aorta, which sends blood to the rest of your body. They are working on the mitral valve, which is the valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle, which is the real big, it's the largest valve in the body, and it's one of the most highest mechanical demands, and generally is the one that is primarily treated by valve repair, not replacement. Okay. Although there is always going to be need in cases where repair is not possible or not recommended, you will need to replace the valve. And so they're working on ways to have a transcutaneous mitral valve replacement as well.
What happens when someone's had a valve replaced and then they got to replace it the second time? Are they going to have more trouble? Let's say the third time, the fourth time. I don't know as a record for this, but what happens after serial replacements?
Yeah, it causes a number of complications as far as I know. By the way, I'm a PhD engineer. I'm not an MD. I'm not a clinician. So if you need good advice, don't contact me. Contact someone who's trained to do this. But the reality is that the valve replacement for a transcutaneous valve is complicated because they're not really designed to do that. So they can do what's called valve-in-valve, where they take a valve and they insert the valve into a catheter, and they actually put a second valve inside the first valve. And obviously you would say, well, doesn't that constrict the opening? And the answer, yes, it does. But in many cases, it's the best option for the patient. So the valve-in-valve is something, but it has its problem.
And what happens to the blood flow when the valve closes and opens? Like, does it build up and like swirl around on the backside of the valve and then build up pressure and then burst forth when it opens? Like, is there any nuance or anything interesting into how the blood again will momentarily pool and then be released?
Right. Well, that's a really excellent question, and that's been very well studied. And that it was actually first studied by Leonardo da Vinci. Okay, and the story goes that he would take animal hearts, or I think even human hearts, kind of created this sort of mock circulation system, filled the fluid instead of blood. He had what's called oil of wintergreen, which was like a clear fluid that would allow you to see through the tissues. Okay, and he actually put little pomegranate seeds inside the blood so we could see which way the flow was going, which is basically how modern particle image velocimetry is done. So he was very much ahead of his time, and he observed how the blood actually flowed in and around the sinuses, the parts of the where the valve sits in the lower part of the ascending aorta, you can everything can be circulated and you can actually watch it. So the hemodynamics of it's called hemo being blood and dynamics being movement. The hemodynamics of the valves are fairly complex, but they're designed to open partly due to the minimal resistance to opening. Also, you have to understand that the aortic valve, the native aortic valve, is actually attached to what's called the aortic root. That is the very beginning of the aorta, and that will actually become larger and smaller over the cardiac cycle. So the whole thing is a very complex coupled system. My work focuses primarily on the mechanics of the cells and tissues that make up the valve, because that's where the pathology occurs. That's where the problems aren't really so much in the hemodynamics, although the hemodynamics are critical to its function. The pathologies, that is the diseases of the valve, and also the problems of replacement heart valve degeneration are in the tissues and materials that make up the valve.
And you said the typical valve is a tricuspid one. Have you thought about trying to replace it with a bicuspid one? Does that improve, or is it not workable for some reason? Like different, what about a multicuspid one?
Well, the trileaflet arrangement is, as you not be surprised to hear, has always worked out to be the very best in terms of central flow. So the hemodynamics of a leaf valve has a nice large central orifice that allows blood to flow smoothly through the valve, and so it's a very much a record. The problem is not in the geometry of the valve. You have to pay attention to it. The problem is in that the constituent materials of the leaflets degenerate through a variety of mechanisms.
Oh, so just what causes it to degenerate? Like the friction of the valve closing and opening, like shears off material, or what happens?
Oh, no. It's well, again, there are two in terms of replacement heart valves made out of chemically treated pericardium, sometimes called xenografts for foreign material. They degenerate either due to mineralization or calcification forming on the leaf, and it's a very complicated mechanism that is responsible for this, or they fail because the material itself wears out. Okay, like most man-made materials, because it's not living and it's not replaced. So eventually, it's a fibrous material, and eventually the fibers break down, they break apart, and the valve will degenerate.
So what about bacteria and stuff that would form in and around these leaflets? I know you're an engineer, not a biologist, but I know there are different kinds of bacteria that appear in different parts of the leaflet and the valve.
Yeah, well, bacteria, generally speaking, there are cases where that can happen. It's generally pretty rare, and bacterial degeneration isn't a problem. Now, in those patients would have rheumatic heart valve failure, which was very common much earlier in the century. Then the bacteria responsible for that, for reasons I'm not sure why, seem to really favor valve tissues, and therefore many patients with rheumatic heart fever will have valve disease. In fact, my wife's grandfather died from mitral valve failure because he had rheumatic heart valve failure, and it attacked his mitral valve, which eventually failed.
Oh, interesting. So this one, what valve is this called, the one we've been talking about, as opposed to the mitral valve, and what are the other ones that are replaceable or not?
Well, technically speaking, all three are treatable. So you have the so-called two semilunar valves. Those are the ones that lie between the ventricle and the outflow artery, and they're called semilunar because the leaflets look like little moons. These are the aortic valve. That's the big one, that between the left ventricle and the ascending aorta, and then the pulmonary valve, which is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery, and that's the pulmonary artery sends blood to the lungs. And then there's the so-called atrioventricular valves, which lie between the left atrium and the left ventricle. That's the mitral valve, and it's called that because it looks like a bishop's mitre, but upside down. And then the tricuspid valve is roughly 3 leaflets, but if you really take a good look at it, it's one large contiguous structure. It's just because it can have a 3 leaflet-like look to it. And that one is in the right ventricle between the right atrium and the right ventricle.
And which ones tend to wear out most, the aortic valve or the mitrals, or the mitral leads itself to repair and aortic to replacement?
Yeah, so generally speaking, the left side valves are the ones that have the most problems, although the tricuspid valve can. So they all have different what's called etiologies, that is disease processes, that make them, they're all quite different. The aortic valve in older patients tends to mineral, it's called aortic insufficiency, where the blood does not allow it to flow through, and that's usually due to aortic stenosis. That is, there's a thickening of the valve and the surrounding structures, and it makes it more difficult for the leaflet to open up and the blood to flow through. And that's usually due to a complicated combination of inflammation and mineralization or calcification. And that's usually and also the root will calcify as well. And so it's not just the valve that calcifies, but the whole artery, everything kind of mineralizes. And then that's actually good for the transcutaneous aortic valve because it can anchor into the mineral deposits of the aortic root. The mitral valve can fail for two major reasons. One is the valve itself degenerates due to sometimes a congenital defect, or for reasons that are not quite understood, the valve will become inflamed and will eventually need to be repaired. Or it's due to people who have a heart attack, what's called a myocardial infarction. The left ventricle will dilate, and that will cause the mitral valve to not close properly, begin to regurgitate. There's all kinds of nasty consequences, and that's another reason. The pulmonary artery valve is generally, it's certainly not disease-free, but it's usually more associated with congenital defects. Okay, and that's a very common location. And the tricuspid valve is often associated with related diseases because the whole system is coupled. The heart is like one organ. So when you have problems with one valve, you'll often have problems with another. And so the tricuspid valve can regurgitate as well.
Oh, interesting. What about if someone's had a heart attack or they have like advanced atherosclerosis? How does that change the risk profile for problems with valves?
Yeah, well, it's a complicated question, but basically what you have is situations like I mentioned where the portions of the left ventricle wall are diseased and no longer contracting and can form a scar. But most dangerously, they become aneurysmal. They can actually dilate out, and because the mitral valve is connected to the ventricle through cords, they're actually tendinous cords. In fact, they're called the chordae tendinae. They will pull the valve open and prevent it from closing properly, and that's called ischemic mitral regurgitation.
What about heart murmurs? What are they associated with? Why would a valve allow a murmur versus not?
Well, like I said, I'm not a clinician, so the actual etiologies of heart murmurs are very complicated. It can become for all kinds of different reasons, not the least of which is just congenital defects of the valve. In fact, that's usually how they're first detected. Go ahead.
In a tricuspid situation versus like bicuspid, like I know from physics, like two objects can hit each other at the exact same time. The three, I guess it'd be almost impossible for them all to close exactly at the same time. Do you see like in a tricuspid valve, like one of the the leaves will be slightly behind in time closing? Like, do they close in a sequence or do they get pretty close to all at once?
No, generally speaking, because of the nature of the anatomy and function, the synchronization of closing isn't really a problem unless one leaflet is damaged or heavily calcified, and for whatever reason the other two are not, which does happen, but not too common. Okay, like again, the major issue, it depends on which valve, but for the aortic valve, it's mostly due to mineralization of the leaflets and the surrounding anatomical structures. The mitral valve, you can get some calcification, and it does occur, but it's mostly due to degeneration of the leaflets or and in the case of a heart attack, myocardial infarction.
Okay. Why not use, metal or plastics or, those for valve replacement?
Let me tell you, everything's been tried and more than one. So the original I mean, so let me just, for those of you who are interested in this, a little bit of history, the first replacement heart valves were ball and cage valves. They were made out of polymer valves, and they were done in the early 60s when the heart-lung machine was first developed. And before that, nobody could, you basically, your prognosis if you had valve disease was not very good. Eventually, they moved toward something called pyrolytic carbon, and it's a very hard, very shiny black material that generally interfaces with the blood pretty well, and it's very strong, and you can make a whole valve out of it. And these are the so-called mechanical heart valves, and the valve leaflets are rigid. They're not soft, pliable structures, but they're rigid. And St. Jude Medical, for example, had a very famous valve, the Bjork-Shiley valve. All these were really worked quite well. The challenge, though, is because of the nature of the design of the valve, the rigidity of the leaflets, and other factors, the patient had to be on anticoagulants, that is blood thinners, for the rest of their lives, because otherwise he would form emboli and lead to stroke. Eventually, though, the tissue valves, the ones that we've been talking about, where they take take animal tissues and chemically treat them and then form valves out of them, kind of took over. Because, first of all, you don't want to be on anticoagulants because they cause a lot of problems. So if you know anybody who is on those, they can be for valves, they can be for people who have atrial fibrillation and so on. There's a lot of complications with blood thinners, with bleeding and many things. And the rate of complication is quite substantial, it can be, even if you dose it properly. The second thing is that the tissue valves, once they're implanted, and usually about a month later after the thing's stabilized, you don't have to be on anticoagulants until you have to replace the valves. That could be a good decade of life. And most people felt that was a much better deal than have to be on anticoagulants, even though these so-called mechanical valves would last basically indefinitely. So that's really that's how, if you look at the demographics of valves, everything shifted over to tissue valves by the late 90s. But the problem of degeneration still remains.
What about creating the existing valve, keep the scaffolding somehow, take the cells out of it, and then culture and, regrow a valve using the existing old extracellular scaffolding and put that in?
Well, that's those so-called engineered tissues or regenerative medicine approaches have been unsuccessful. It's extremely difficult for cells to, wherever they're from, whether they're blood originating or coming in from the aortic wall, to repopulate those matrices and maintain them like a living valve. That has not happened yet, and we don't understand yet how to do that, although the people are working on that.
What are you expecting to be the new stuff coming out in the next few years? Anything in the pipeline you could talk about?
Yeah, there is. We actually got a new NIH grant to look at a special type of polymeric materials that have special gel coatings. And the idea is that you separate the function of valve from internal structure, 3D structure, with a gel coating that handles the blood interface. And I think these have a lot of promise, and, we just have to see how they come out. I think we're primarily learning what it would take to make a valve out of these materials. See, people have to understand that, we all want the next therapies within a few years, but the valves are extremely complicated, and there's a lot of stuff that goes on. And, we need time to, if you try to do things kind of by brute force, by kind of empirically, then unfortunately it ends up it generally doesn't work because of all because it's sort of like trying to make a complicated precision machine by just trial and error. Okay. And you really need to have I would say one of the things that I think is extremely important is to develop a very good understanding of what it would take to make the valve and how to really get this into a much more durable replacements. Okay. And, so, these are what people have been able to do to date has worked okay. These tissue valves, have been developed largely through many years of experience by some very talented engineers and clinicians that I've interacted with myself. But you reach a level where, that will only only take you so far. And then now you need to move to a new generation where you really need to understand what the mechanisms are and how to optimize their designs. And that's really what our group and several other groups around the world are trying to do.
Well, very good. What's the place for people to maybe see the various heart valves in action and to keep up with the latest news about them?
Well, there's a number of news sources. There's American Heart, which is a very good news source. And also there's a number of websites that dedicate themselves, like from the Cleveland Clinic and other ones that can tell you what is the latest success rates and so on. It's a lot of studies, a lot of activity, and it may take a little time to sift through it. There's not a single magic bullet, for sure.
Okay. For your work in particular, where can people go to keep tabs on it?
Oh, we just look on our website, and, we're in the process of updating it, so it's a little out of date right now. But we're working on trying to do a number of things with these new materials that my colleague here at UT, Dr. Cosme Fernandez, developed, and my colleague, Dr. Prasad Dasi, down at Georgia Tech, who we worked together on a 3-way grant. Dr. Dasi does a lot of benchtop verification, valve, and we're working on the materials analysis and optimal geometries and so on. So that's kind of what we're up to. And so it's a very complicated approach, and there is a lot of things to take care of. We have to work the mechanics of the materials, the design of the valve, the durability of the valve, the design of the device, and how the material interacts with blood and maintains its durability and does not cause calcification and thrombosis and many things all happening at the same time.
Okay. Well, very good. Oh my God, thanks for coming and explaining all this stuff is very interesting. I appreciate you being here.
My pleasure.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.